Hi guys, today we are going to revise popular recreation for A-level PE, and we're going to be a really quick video on this one because it's a fairly straightforward area. So first thing you need to know are the characteristics of popular recreations and how they reflect society in the pre-industrial times. Maybe links to calendars, this comes up in exam questions, and different classes, the difference between the gentry and the peasants and the types of activities they may or may not have played. So the first area, and you can probably pause this and just look through these, is trying to remember all the characteristics of the plucky crow. Each letter stands for a characteristic, and the easiest way to remember sort of like some of the characteristics of mob games. Now this will probably only be a 4-mark exam question, just knowing 4 of them, but also knowing how it reflects society. So you can just pause this video and have a read of these, but in general, I would go with the fact that they were localized. So we got peasants here, or people from the lower class. The difference between, and you could link it into society being a feudal system with this 2-tier society. The localized because of lack of transport, unwritten and uncoded because of illiteracy of peasants. They couldn't read or write. Cruel and violent reflected the harsh society, and also there was always preparation for war because we were always at war. Inexpensive because of lack of ability to buy particular bits of equipment. They didn't have the money. And we can carry on with courtly, rural areas, occasional, wagering. Okay, so all of these are characteristics of popular recreations, and each of them has an impact or reflection on society. So just make sure you've know about 4 to 5 different characteristics and how they reflect society. And if you need to pause the video to read them, just do that. Oops. Right, so popular recreations. Sometimes you might be asked about the role of the church or how it influenced the times of where popular recreations were played. And this little slide just really talks about the church. So if it's an exam question, there's either sometimes about when were they played or what was the role of the church in popular recreations, and that's this sort of information here. So holy days and wakes, and they were occasionally played, is one of your key points here. So generally played on holy days or religious days, and wakes where people obviously after a funeral. Now this was because it was the only time they had free from their work, so it's essentially their leisure time, and it was a chance to let off steam and socially get together, an opportunity for the community to get together. Now, in terms of the role of the church, you've got things like patronage from the church, which means the church is offering prize money and sponsorship, if you like, or backing and supporting it. You might have had village versus village matches, which could also be parish versus parish. So the villages tend to be centered around the church, and could be one side of the village versus another side, or it could be literally a parish versus parish, depends on the location and geography. Church lands could be used. Okay, I think they tended to avoid the graveyards, but they could be used. But essentially the church was the social meeting place for the residents in the villages back then. They would get together on a Sunday, and obviously one location for everybody to meet, and then games sort of spawned from there. But obviously, particularly if it was the holy days where they had the time free from work. So the influence of agriculture sometimes comes up in an exam question, and it sometimes comes up as a rural. What was the impact of the rural sort of side of popular recreation? So in terms of agriculture, and the games were cruel and harsh because life was cruel and harsh. People working on the fields with their hands, living quite a harsh lifestyle, and their games reflected those sort of aspects. The time off was infrequent because they were literally always working on the farms, either harvesting crops or preparing crops. So activities were based around agriculture, and they would play them in times of celebration. So think about harvest festivals and those sort of agricultural sort of celebrations. The winter was the better time to play the mob games, when they played them on the fields and across fields, so they weren't likely to damage the crops, whereas if they did it in the summer, it would potentially damage their crop yield. Now, the rural aspect meant, because the country was rural back in these days, the activities were localized, and the rules were spread by word of mouth because there was the lack of transport and inability to travel up and down the country. Because it was rural, there was lots of space available to play these games, and they used the countryside that they were based in and used natural restrictions for their games, things like rivers, fields, field boundaries, hedges, and so on and so forth. So the other side of it you might get asked a question on is, what was the influence of the feudal system? So the feudal system means that it was a two-tier social order where we essentially have the gentry, the upper class, versus the peasants, the working class. So there's two-tier systems, and they had different sort of approaches, and this has been the sort of the difference between them. Now, the gentry were non-work based activities. They didn't do activities. Now, some of the activities were things like foot races by foot, think about their footmen. They had people who would take part in activities racing against one another, and the gentry would bet on them and things like that. So the gentry didn't really get involved with those sort of hard tasks where they would be sort of performing work-based activities. Now, they saw themselves as more civilized and more sophisticated, so their sports and activities reflected that, more things like horse riding, and they developed real tennis, which is the courtly side of it. They could play them at any time because they had the free time, so it wasn't occasional. They had the free time, they weren't working, they just sort of did the sports when they felt like it. And they really avoided any sort of the contact side of sport. It was because they were civilized and sophisticated, their activities were non-contact based. Now, we've already talked a lot about the popular creations and some of the aspects there, and you just need to remember some of them, but some of the generic ones is they were poor, so they had no resources in the peasants. There were limited rules because they couldn't read or write, they were illiterate, and they were often harsh games because they were being prepared for war, because Britain was in a lot of wars at those times. Now, this is more of a task, really, so you just pause the video, decide which of these characteristics linked to the gentry, which is these green box here, and which of them are more mob games and popular creations, which is this blue box here, and there's loads of different sort of characteristics. So literally just pause the video and just sort of rattle through them and just see which is courtly and which is more mob games. And here's your answers. So I've put in here this yellow box here with Haxley Hood. It's just an example of a mob game that you could be mentioning. Obviously, real tennis is the example here on the screen, but the idea is that mob games are more cruel and violent, force-based, localized, lower class, used natural facilities, had unwritten rules, whereas the gentry had purpose-built facilities. They had a real tennis courts built around the country, had more complex rules, expensive equipment. It was structured. They could travel to play because they had the horse and cart and they had the time. Horse and carriages, sorry, and had the time. It could be played regularly, and it was not violent. It was played by the elite, the upper class. Elements of etiquette were involved in this. So that is sort of covered all of the sort of previous exam questions that have come up on this area. It should be straightforward for most people, but do revise it because it's a fairly simplistic area and you don't want to be dropping marks in these easy mark areas. So hope this helps, and good luck in your exams.